Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and this is a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. Transparently, I use AI to help develop these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So yesterday, we were talking about how Ezra Klein was asking, what is lost when we don't have to do the work of building out our own thinking? And today, we have some answers, and they come to us from a lab at the Wharton School at UPenn. So a quick flag is that what we're going to draw on today is a preprint. So it hasn't yet completed peer review, but I still think it's quite relevant. And I want to flag that because we take seriously where evidence comes from. But that said, it's rigorous, it's carefully designed experimental work, and I think its findings are significant enough to warrant serious attention now. So let me describe what they did. The researchers conducted 3 experiments with nearly 1,400 participants. And the researchers, Shaw and Nave, gave people reasoning problems to solve with and without access to an AI assistant. Sometimes the AI was right, sometimes it was deliberately wrong but confident, if that sounds familiar, and then they tracked what happened. So the finding is that when people had access to AI, they used it on more than half of all trials. And when they did, their accuracy tracked the AI's accuracy almost completely. So when the AI was right, they did better than without it. But when the AI was wrong, they did substantially worse than if they'd never had access. This is what the researchers are terming cognitive surrender. It's a measurable behavioral pattern, and we want to dive into some of the findings from the research because they have real implications for teaching and learning in the classroom. So there's 2 findings that I want to spend a little time with. The first is time pressure. In the second experiment of the 3 that they conducted, Shaw and Nave introduced a time constraint. They put the subjects under pressure, and what they saw was that under pressure, cognitive surrender increased. That is to say, people were significantly more likely to accept the AI output without scrutiny when they had less time to think. It's pretty intuitive, I think. Now, holding that finding against the reality of a school day, you can start to see the implications. Students are completing assignments under pressure. Teachers are reviewing work under pressure. Time pressure isn't some kind of edge case in education. For those working in schools, they know this is a baseline condition. And the research is telling us that in this environment where most teachers and students are spending their time, that's precisely, or lacking time, I should say, is precisely the environment where cognitive surrender is likely. So we're creating the conditions, we're working within conditions where cognitive surrender is very likely. The second finding is about who's most susceptible to that cognitive surrender. The participants who showed the greatest cognitive surrender were those with higher trust in AI and lower intrinsic motivation to engage in effortful thinking. So think for a moment about that profile and how that lines up against students that you know in your classrooms. Those who have higher trust in AI and lower intrinsic motivation to engage in effortful thinking. That's a profile that should raise real questions about which students are most at risk of cognitive surrender. It also connects directly to the equity concerns that we've talked about on this podcast before. If AI access without scaffolding functions differently for different students, we need to be very honest about that rather than assume that the tool is neutral. Third, this is the one that's hardest to sit with. The third implication, Shaw and Nave found that access to AI increased participants' confidence, even when the AI was wrong. People felt more certain about answers that were less accurate. There's a danger here directly related to the fluency by which the AI is producing answers. It doesn't just bypass the critical thinking, it's replacing the idea that critical thinking is needed. All of this sort of rolls up to the underlying message that I want to convey in this podcast, this whole series really, is that AI should be following the lesson plan, not writing the lesson plan. The lesson plan is the structure, the design that determines when student thinking is supposed to happen. And if AI enters before that thinking has occurred, it preempts that process. And the research says that we shouldn't expect students to catch errors. And in fact, we've designed the conditions for surrender. So all of that raises serious concerns. But there is some hope, and that is in the one intervention that reduced cognitive surrender meaningfully in these studies. That is when participants had a genuine stake in their accuracy and received immediate feedback on the responses. In those two cases, they were significantly more likely to override the faulty AI. They would start to check and they would catch the errors. Say that again. When they had a genuine stake in the accuracy and when they received immediate feedback. This is incredibly important because effective assessment should give the student a reason to care. The grade that they're receiving is not an afterthought, and the feedback that makes the quality of the student's own thinking visible to them in the moment is meaningful. So let's move to 3 sets of implications and takeaways for teachers, for instructional coaches, and for district leaders. First, for teachers, the antidote to cognitive surrender is not to ban AI. I think at this point that's a foregone conclusion and quite impossible. The antidote is to design tasks where students have something at stake in their own thinking and where they receive feedback that makes the thinking and its quality more visible. So as you're designing assignments, ask yourself, does the assignment give my students a reason to engage their own judgment? If the answer is no, there's a high likelihood, given the conditions in which they're working, that AI will fill that space, and you will see that in their work product. For instructional coaches, think about the research as an audit tool. When you're looking at AI integrated lessons that you might receive from teachers or as part of group collaboration, examine where the student thinking is required to happen and think about how it positions relative to the AI. Is it before the AI? Is it with the AI? Is it after, or is it never? How that sequence unfolds tells a lot about how students are likely to respond given the conditions that predispose them towards cognitive surrender. Third, for district leaders, the time pressure is real, and we've heard many different incarnations of this concern around time pressure, and this is only the latest, but it's real. If teachers are using AI to manage workloads that are unsustainable, and we've talked a little bit about this in a prior episode, they're being positioned for cognitive surrender in ways that are similar to what's happening to their students. So it's a story about student learning, but it's also a story, I think, about staffing and workload. So being sensitive to the conditions in which teachers are operating will heighten sensitivity and awareness as to what may be leading to greater instances of cognitive surrender in lesson planning, which has implications for cognitive surrender in student thinking. So all of this is to say that this conversation around cognitive surrender, what's been showing up in Klein's essay and in this research, is showing up in more places too. Just this morning, I read a piece on Forbes that ran last week with practical tips for avoiding cognitive surrender. To me, that's a sign that this idea is taking root. You'll notice that in this conversation, what we're talking about with Klein's essay and in this research, this dialogue around this dynamic of cognitive surrender is starting to become mainstream. And I think this has significant implications for all of us who work in the education ecosystem, especially those on the front line in classrooms. Educators who are working in these circumstances don't just need tips, they need an understanding of the framework. And I think that's what you get from these 2 articles by Klein and then this research. Why is this dynamic unfolding? Under what conditions, and what are the moves from an instructional design perspective that can be made to help prevent it? I hope you found this useful, and I hope you'll take a look at the article by Klein and also the article from the UPenn researchers. Highly practical, highly relevant, worth your time. Thanks for spending a little time today. We'll see you in the next episode.